Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm your host, Andrew Baskin. The goal of this interview series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, diverse, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business as a force for good. In this episode of Next Economy Now, Aaron Axelrod, a partner at the Economy, interviews Tur-Ha Ak. Tur-Ha is the CEO of Urban Protection Industries, a harm reduction security company. Tur-Ha created the unique harm reduction security model to provide security for drug rehabilitation clinics in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco in the 1990s. The harm reduction security model emphasizes maintaining and enforcing boundaries within a specific geographical area and building and utilizing community relationships to enhance security. Urban Protection continues to use this model today as the primary security for the Laurel Business Improvement District in Oakland. Urban Protection has also provided personal security services for Cheryl Davila of Berkeley City Council, Patrisse Cullors of Black Lives Matter, and Kat Brooks, a former mayoral candidate in Oakland, in the face of heightened threats from white nationalists. Tur-Ha is also the founder of Community Ready Core, a Black grassroots organization with a mission to organize and empower the Black community towards safety, self-determination, and equity. Under his leadership, Community Ready Core has spearheaded and helped build effective multiracial coalitions that address the most pressing issues facing the Black community in the Bay Area, including the Anti-Police Terror Project, which created the first replicable model nationally for community rapid response to police violence, the State of Black Oakland, a People's Assembly, and Oakland Justice Coalition, recognizing that Black people face a triple threat of state, racist vigilante, and intercommunal violence. Tur-Ha has dedicated his life to creating a culture and climate of safety and protection in Black communities by organizing neighborhood safety teams and rapid response networks and providing free, regular self-defense training for children and adults. Nicole Deane is an organizer, filmmaker, and co-founder of Community Ready Core Allies and Accomplices, a cross-class, intergenerational, and multi-tendency organization of white people committed to fighting white supremacy. Community Ready Core Allies and Accomplices works to move, teach, and support white people to weaponize white privilege and divest of white power and to organize in a direct and disciplined relationship with Community Ready Core. So without further ado, please enjoy Aaron Axelrod's conversation with Tur-Ha Ak and Nicole Deane.
Tur-Ha and Nicole, welcome to the show. So want to start with you, Tur-Ha. Could you tell listeners a bit about your background? How did you get into this work? And just tell us a little bit about Community Ready Core.
Started out doing this work maybe in the late 80s. Honestly, I've been doing it for so long. I guess all of my adult life, I always have to break it down into periods. So started out in the late 80s. That was my first attempts at organizing. I met some folks that were from Oakland, California, and began to organize with them in the South. And then I eventually moved out to Oakland, California in the early 90s and was a part of an organization for a long time. Left that organization and somewhere in a transition and trying to figure out where I was going to go next and what we were going to do next, Oscar Grant happened. And when Oscar Grant got murdered, my organizing took a drastic shift. I began to organize and engage in the protest movement in a way that I hadn't previously done. So that combined with my previous organizing has kind of brought us to this place. As a matter of fact, with CRC was actually born in that moment when Oscar Grant got murdered. Because what we did was when we begin to organize and do logistics for different movements, different protests, our orientation was that we needed to have some organizational frame that people could address us by. And so in that moment, we became the Community Ready team. And our organizing brains just kept developing that, and it became the Community Ready Core. And that's really where it was born and how we got to this point where we are right now. And in that, we really found that our approach was to support and figure out how we could contribute to activity that was already currently taking place and whatever that may have looked like, whether it was logistics, whether it was strategic support, whether it was mediation, whether it was like sound, security, you name it, we've done it.
I'm really honored to learn from you around the work that you have done to support communities and to support organizing, which we see as so critical to the next economy. And I'm curious if you could bring us in a bit to your vision of the next economy, one that truly works for everyone, and share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the economic question. And as far as we're concerned, and the way that we approach even the economic question is we begin with the fact that Black people, Africans, we've always existed under the yoke of predatory economics from our first contact here. Well, we can talk about that Africans visited what is now called the Americas before slavery, and that's an important truth. But in this current iteration, we, from day one, have existed as the driving mechanism of a predatory economy, as the defining element of a predatory economy. So the fact of the matter is that this whole framework that we're talking about, what comes after it, is built on the backs of Black people.
Right.
And so much of it still sits on the back of disenfranchised folks, of Black people. And be clear, we're not saying just Black people. We're saying that disenfranchised people, that this thing is built on our backs. And so when we talk about what's next, we have to begin the discussion there, because if we don't begin the discussion there, we won't adequately formulate just and equitable next steps.
I so agree, and really am grateful for the work you do to really bolster communities, frontline communities, support the work that they're engaged in right now. Could you talk a little bit about that theory of change around how?
And I guess I could continue with that line of thinking, right? So what's key in that is as we talk about next steps, the next step has to be one of self-determination, in our opinion. That self-determination as defined by Minister Huey P. Newton, meaning that power is the ability to define phenomenon and make it act in a desired manner. And I'll say that again, that power is the ability to define phenomenon and make it act in a desired manner, right? And that definition is so important because this is what we lack. This is what Black people lack on the planet, whether we're talking about America or Africa, whether we're talking about America or Africa, or South America, wherever people of color, Black people exist, there's somebody else that's dominating our economies, right? We're watching what's happening in Venezuela right now. This is an important moment. This is an important moment. How this gets handled will define a lot. But that next economy, that next economic iteration has to be rooted in people's ability to define what is best for them, and then them having the ability to bring it about. And that means we're gonna that particularly for white people, there are gonna have to be some very uncomfortable conversations and circumstances, because the vast majority of the world's population doesn't control its own wealth, doesn't control its own resources. And so whatever economy we're talking about has to be rooted in people benefiting and controlling their own resources, land, and economies. And so when we talk about a theory of change, our theory of change is rooted in that concept, in that idea defined by Minister Huey P. Newton. That power is the ability to define phenomenon and make it act in a desired manner. So that means that each community has to do the work to analyze, assess, formulate strategies, implement strategies in their own benefit.
You mentioned people benefiting and controlling their own land, resources, and economies. This is starkly more precise, it feels to me, than some of maybe the messaging that we're hearing coming from the privileged elite around doing well by doing good as the pathway to the next economy. And it's why it's so important to me that people like you are a part of this economic discussion. And I wonder if you have anything to add just around the critique of the mainstream messaging that's out there.
I mean, one of the things we talk about is what we call the persistent reestablishment of white supremacy. And what we talk about, and this is a term that we apply primarily to the left, and it's actually acknowledging a fallacy that white supremacy ever went anywhere in the left, right? But let's accept that premise that the left is attempting to not engage in typical white supremacist ways, which we know is not the case often. But we use the term the persistent reestablishment of white supremacy to identify the phenomenon, the occurrence of spaces that are supposed to be combating white supremacy, but just reinvigorates it in a different way with different clothing, different language, different approaches. So everything that exists right now, we have to very critically, meticulously, always examine it for its reestablishment, its reinvigorating of white supremacist practices. So most of the language that we see right now is not talking about divestment. And we have 5 methods that we have suggested for white allies and accomplices to engage. We call them the 5 methods of weaponization and divestment of white privilege and power. So one is education, or another is organization, another is contribution, another is intervention, and another is the divestment, right? So we talk about those things, is that we give those 5 methods because we want a concrete criteria for what it means to engage in anti-racist behavior, anti-racist engagement. So that's important because we have to establish concrete criteria to judge ourselves by. And if we have this, these nebulous approaches to it, these really abstract approaches to it, then we most certainly will always return to white supremacist practices. One of the things that I say is that the default setting of the world right now, but particularly of America, is white, male, patriarchal control. And so everything will come back to that reality if we are not deliberate about dismantling those systems.
And talk about how dismantling those systems is in the benefit of all of us.
So I think divestment is a really critical piece here. Because I think when we talk about the white supremacy economy that we live in, we, for good reason, focus on the negative impacts that it has on Black people. But it has a lot of negative impacts on white people too. And when we look at the white community in America right now, across the class spectrum, and it's not to say that all white people have money, but when we look at the white community as a whole, across class, we're a community that is suffering. We're a community that is struggling with addiction and struggling with mental illness. And in my opinion, struggling with spiritual death because we're participating in a spiritually dead system. And so I think a lot of the conversations that people have about, the next economy and the stuff you said about, doing good to do well, if it doesn't address, if we don't deal with divestment, we're going to keep going in circles. I have another anti-racist mentor named Reverend Lenise Pinkard who says that white Americans are impoverished on the deepest level because even though we have more than we need, we still want more than we have. And the more we have, the more we want. And so I see white people, particularly white people with wealth, as really addicted to money in a way that's very damaging. And we're constantly trying to acquire and we're constantly hoarding. And so divestment it's a spiritual discipline to turn away from that way of life, because this way of life is killing us and it's killing a lot of people. Divestment is about letting go of our compulsive need to control as many resources as possible. And I think also in my time as an organizer and as a fundraiser, I've really seen that white people have like a deep existential resistance to giving money to Black people. I've just seen it a lot in fundraising. Organizations that are led by white people, particularly white men, like people really will just write checks and hand them to these white men. And they feel there's really this deep idea that, you know, white men and white people are the experts and white men and white people are competent, good at handling money, and they're going to be smart about it. And there's going to be a return on investment. And that won't be the case if we give money to Black-led organizations. And in my experience, the opposite is true. You know, there's a lot of dysfunction and corruption in these kind of like white supremacist institutions. And so for me, divestment is about really transforming that resistance in myself and like collectively working with other white people to divest of our resources and to give it to the Black community for them to be able to, like Tur-Ha said, control and benefit from their own economy.
This is a really great segue into the Black Solidarity Strategy and the Black Solidarity Fund. Curious if you could share with our listeners some updates there and what that is.
Well, last year, in 2018, we did our first Black Solidarity Week, which starts on the birthday of Minister Huey P. Newton, February 17th. And it runs through the assassination of Malcolm X. And it runs through that weekend. So this year to be the 17th through the 23rd. We're actually in the process of organizing with community to devise what the dates will be. What the actual events will be. Last year we did a big march through East Oakland, which doesn't typically happen. We had a lot of the community there with us and some wonderful organizations that helped us to organize that. And we worked with community organizations to do so. We had a wonderful event with some former Black Panthers, surviving smash and grab. And they really talked about their experiences with state repression. And we talked about how that applies now and what we're about to enter into. This phase we're currently in. We had a host of community organizations that calendared their events throughout the weekend, which that's what we ultimately hope for. And one of the most interesting things that we're trying to get off the ground this year was what we call a Week of Peace. And we wanted Black Solidarity to be this sacred space in a sense that we could have some conversations with what my brother Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. calls street tribes, and folks who are out in what they would call a criminal economy, what they would call in the streets, and have some direct conversations with folks who are maneuvering in those arenas, because often these are the arenas that are talked about, acted upon, but not acted with and talked with and involved in their own progress and upliftment. And so we hope to do something different along those lines. So we want to do a Week of Peace last year, just didn't shake out. And then we were very interested to find out when it was all said and done, when somebody called me and looked at the numbers for the week, the stats for the week, and they said that there were no violent crimes that took place during the week. And it was just interesting that was our hope, and it happened without us expressing it. So this year we are organizing that Week of Peace, working with different folks that we would say from the streets. That's, cats that are on the block, and attempting to have those conversations in a meaningful way. We can't promise anything. We don't know how it'll turn out, but at least we'll be engaging and having that dialogue. And then we intend to have some type of celebration to close out. But like I said, right now, we're actually in the process of organizing the week and working with community, meeting with community organizations, because that's really what it's all about. And so this week is typically the launching point for what this past year in 2018, we did a number of listening sessions where we came and brought the community together and under different headings, because we have what we call under the Community Ready Core, the 9 areas or components of self-determination. And those 9 components are economics, health, art, media, family, politics, self-defense, what else? Traditions and ways, and education. Right, that was all 9. And so in those 9 areas, what we're doing is we intend to organize our community in those 9 components. But we're looking for people who are already doing work in those areas and figuring out how we can support the work that's already happening, for the most part, because sometimes what we hope to do eventually is establish our own programs in each one of those areas. But currently, we want to support. And so what we did was we have listening sessions in those 9 areas from people who are doing the work. This year coming up, though, we will present the Black Solidarity Agenda and Plan of Action. And so when we present that in 2019, what we hope to have is the solidarity sessions, that we move from listening sessions to solidarity sessions of now we figure out what it means for us to mobilize and move on this Black Solidarity Agenda and Plan of Action. Because once again, we as one organization, we as a collective of organizations can come together and put some things together, and we're attempting to do that based on what we got from the listening sessions and previous organizing attempts to get to this point. And then but now it's time to figure out how we take action and mobilize around these things that we listen to. So that is what we intend to do throughout 2019. And that brings us to the Black Solidarity Fund. And the Black Solidarity Fund is our goal this year was to raise $30,000. We've raised about 25 of that already. And we've already begun giving out what we have termed Black Solidarity micro grants. And, we initially wanted to give out grants to 10 organizations of $500, but we've ended up working with some organizations to the tune of $1,500 and so it's between $1,500 and $500. We've already given out about 9 of those grants. And we are raising money to do 2 things. One is to support existing programs for other organizations, because our one of the key principles for us is connection through contribution. That we want to create this relationship of solidarity by being beneficial to other organizations. And so that is one aspect of the Black Solidarity Fund. And the other aspect is so we can fund the programs that we're attempting to get off the ground. And one of those programs is the Crc Youth Core. What was previously in May, we're bouncing this name around, was the Siafu Youth Core. And it is based on an ant in Africa that is one of the most feared entities, not just insect, on the plains of Africa, because these ants link up. And when they link up, it's millions of them. And they come through, and sometimes their caravans are miles long and wide, right? And so the elephants and the lions and everybody moves out of the way of these ants, because they know that this collective of these very small creatures, they always win. They always win. There's footage of them taking down lions and taking down elephants, right? Taking down wildebeest. And we thought that was profound. We thought that was profound symbolism, that these very, very tiny creatures rule the savannah, rule the plains when they came through. That the king of the jungle, the mighty lion, could not stand against these little ants when they stuck together. And it's interesting because it's fitting that most of the ants that are the ones that are creating these caravans are female ants. So it's an interesting analogy for this time period. But we have this strategy that we've operated for years and we want to expand on, is the Siafu Youth Core. And then there's also the Siafu Adult Core, which is a thing that we are attempting to use to organize our communities, to say the focus is creating leadership for this thing we call self-determination, right? Because you have to prepare people to be self-determined. It's a part of the divestment frame that we say to communities that have privilege, to say, give those communities, give those skill sets away to other communities, to the point that they don't need you anymore, to the point that they're not dependent upon you. So then we want to create, and our objective is to create leadership through the Siafu Youth Core, the CRC Youth Core, and create a support network of adults that can help make sure that these children who are being processed to be self-determined leaders have the support they need. So that is ultimately our strategy. And I guess it's in a long-term vision is the safe house, is having safe houses, what we call safe houses, where these 9 areas where these trainings, these programs can be held. But in the meantime, in transition, because we want to really deal with A to B strategies as opposed to A to Z strategies. How do we get to just point B? And so a point B strategy is safe house satellite sites. And that will be where we hold safe passage on safe space programs, safe space programs. And so that is the strategy in a nutshell. And we've currently been implementing this over the last 20 years. But we've learned a lot. And so now at this point, we want to professionalize and expand.
I have to bring in here what you were saying around the way you think about leadership and the way you think about elevating and amplifying many, many voices, as opposed to, I just want to read a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown. She says, "The shiny stars are rarely the ones actually getting the work done or even doing the most exciting thinking in the organization." How do you really tangibly help support leadership to look a different way? And to you, what defines what you see in the leaders that you're moving forward in the Siafu and in these micro enterprise grants? What do you look for in leadership, and how do you cultivate that?
It's complicated. It's complicated because there are going to be many types of organizations that we will give these micro grants to, because for one, we're not attempting to dictate people's politics. So one thing is that they are a benefit in one way or another to the community. It's going to take some very complex conversations for us to get to that point of having this unified definition of what is and what should be. But our criteria for that is maximum people's benefit, is that it's benefiting the maximum number of people. And now we don't believe in utopian politics, so we know that everything won't be perfect. And we know that we're going to have struggles, and we're going to have there's going to be mistakes, and we're going to have to fix mistakes, and all of those things. So when we're looking at leadership, we take all of those things into account. But our aspiration is to get to a point of where we are creating the type of leadership that sees themselves as a part of the community, as opposed to the head of a community. And that's important. We want to have this concept of contribution, of connection through contribution, currency through contribution. And that if you want political capital, then you have to concretely and tangibly contribute in ways that are impactful and meaningful. And that's the thing that's missing from the conversation right now, that too often the criteria is that you have a good explanation, a good presentation, a good theory of change, as opposed to a practice of change. And so that becomes our standard in this day and age. And so if I have a good enough rap, if I have a good enough slideshow, and I have minimal evidence to prove that it is a thing, then I'll get more funding than the person who's doing all of the work and cannot articulate it as well. And that's not to diminish the need for good articulation. That's not to diminish the need for good theory, because it's a synergistic relationship between theory and practice. practice and theory. It's an ebb and flow there. You can't have one without the other. But I think the thing that's really missing is good practice, because there is no end to theories of change. We could sit here all day and never, ever run out of explanations. But one of the things that we hope to be a part of, and I want to say this humbly, because we're all trying, we're all attempting to get to a place. None of us have come up with a solution, us included. So we're attempting to do this thing. And so hopefully when it's all said and done, we will have contributed in a way that was impactful and meaningful, and we will have contributed to creating or leadership that had a philosophy of a criteria of impact versus rhetoric.
You have brought in so many principles that I believe at Lift Economy can dramatically shift our economic system towards more justice and equity. Things like just you modeling right now, humility, democratization of input and decision-making, empowerment of ownership, decentralization of ownership of both ideas and resources. Mm-hmm. What are other principles that you believe can shift our economic system?
I think in route to self-determination, we have to look at a concept that we call extraction. The concept of extraction is taking from existing systems and giving those resources to places that are intentionally self-determined, intentionally attempting to disconnect in the healthiest possible way. Not in adventurous ways, not in abstract, idealistic ways, in very concrete, healthy ways. And when I say concrete and healthy, I mean ways that really benefit the communities that are being impacted. That's a concept that I think is important, is extraction, because there's constantly this dialogue, specifically right now that's happening with Kamala Harris. And we're consistently being pushed to make this choice between the lesser of two evils. And so one of the things that I was talking to somebody today, and I think I made a Facebook post that said that eventually that if we are consistently talking about the lesser of two evils, then at some point we have to begin to cast out the demons, right? We have to cast out the demons and make way for just and equitable options and alternatives. Else, ultimately, we're just down with evil. Ultimately, if we consistently, decade after decade, century after century, told that our only options are the lesser of two evils, then ultimately we become a system in society that's down with evil. And that's ultimately where we've landed at.
So how can listeners be in solidarity with Community Ready Core specifically and the Black community in general?
One of the real mandate from CRC to white people is the 5 methods, practicing the 5 methods and doing it both individually and collectively. So the 5 methods are education, organization, contribution, intervention, and divestment. The most important thing with education that I want to say to people is that anti-racist education is about learning that you can and should learn from Black people and retraining yourself to assume that you have something to learn from Black people. Organization is critical. We cannot do anything to change the economic or political or social systems that we have issues with as individuals. You have to get organized. You have to join an organization. There's a lot of organizations out here doing great work. And if you don't like any of the organizations, then start one yourself, but you need an organization. Contribution, for white people, this is about contribution, not control. So wherever you are, wherever you see Black people doing work towards their own self-determination, ask how you can contribute and try to think about, proactively, what do you have to offer? What skill sets, what relationships, what resources that you can offer, but don't assume or start to think that your contributions entitle you to control, because we really need to let go of that. Intervention is about intervening in racist harm when we see it happening, preventing it if possible, but intervening if necessary, and really looking at that intervention as our responsibility as white people. And then the last thing is divestment, finding ways to move money, finding ways to move your money and to divest towards Black organizations that are doing real work in the community that's towards self-determination. CRCA is the White Allies and Accomplices flank of the organization to CRC. And we're organizing in the Bay Area. So if you're in the Bay Area and you want to organize with CRCA, you can email us at alliesandaccomplices@gmail.com. And if you're not in the Bay Area, you can just practice the 5 methods in your own life.
And encourage people to go to the website, which is CRC, the number 4, S as in Sam, D as in dog.org, because the way you've laid out this framework for justice on the website has been extremely helpful for me, and just appreciating that so much of your work seems to be this really important fractal of what are the patterns and principles that can be applicable at many different levels of our lives and our engagement. And I
think that's important.
Yeah.
I think it's important to acknowledge that everybody doesn't have to be the greatest revolutionary or the greatest activist, any of those things. We're not asking for that. And I don't think anybody, everybody, there should be a space for people to participate at whatever level they choose to. I personally hope to escape the arrogance of believing that everybody has to do what I'm doing, or that I can define what acceptable activity is. But people have to define that for themselves. I was taught as an organizer that you should be seeking whatever commitment people are willing to give. So if they say, listen, I can give you 2% of my time, then I'm trying to get all 2% of that. But it's not, we definitely hope to inspire people to give 100%. Absolutely. Absolutely. But our goal and approach is to give folks the opportunity to do it at whatever level they see fit.
Well, thank you for that. As we bring our conversation to a close, is there all of these things you've mentioned have been just gems of advice, and I'm wondering if there's just any advice or thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with, particularly folks that are looking at intervention in the economic system, what people should be thinking about. Any additional remarks?
I think we're absolutely in sync here, because you use the exact right term for what I was about to say. It's an intervention. There's a reality right now. We're watching what's happening in Venezuela, and we're watching the formulation of a coup by the United States under the Trump administration. And this is a tactic that's used in general when it comes to people of color, when it comes to disenfranchised folks around the world and in America. One of the things that has been in play for a little while is the crackdown on dissent and dissenters. I just saw an article about there were 5 police officers who were shot in Houston. And so now that's being used as an excuse to crack down on anybody who criticizes. I think it was the sheriff of the police department in Houston, I think it was, who reportedly made the statement. And I haven't fact checked this, but I saw this, that it was reported that the chief of police said that they will seek out anybody who is criticizing the police department and basically make them pay a price for it. Now, he may have been angry. Once again, I haven't fact checked this. So this was something that I saw shortly before we started here. If that's true, this has been a sentiment that's been expressed multiple times. We definitely cannot allow dissent to be cracked down on. And I'm not advocating any violence towards anybody. That's not my point at all. My point is that when we are not allowed, when there's a crackdown, we saw it and we see it in Venezuela, we saw it in Brazil. It's been tragic. the crackdown on reporters and not letting out how brutal the police department agencies were on people. And so this is not just about policing. And I want to be clear on that. This is not just a statement about policing, because police are an arm of a broader system. But it is about the fact that the right to dissent is a critical step towards self-determination. And so we definitely want to make sure that we are looking out for that. And when we see it, we speak up. We speak up about it. And we make sure that the people who are out here doing the work to create justice and equity and fairness and love in our communities are taken care of, because they're often left out to dry. I just saw a quote from KRS-One that said that if serving the people, and I'm paraphrasing here, was profitable, more people would do it. But it's hard to convince people to step up and be of service to their communities when so many of our leaders, and I use that term with quotes, because these are really just people who are serving their community, contributing to their community, are left broke and destitute. And then when they're attacked by the very forces that they're attempting to save the people from, the people don't support them. There's no real outcry. There's no real movement to prevent that from happening. And so I think one of the things that we want to make sure happens moving forward is that the people who are doing service, who are serving the community, are not left alone, are not isolated, are not left broke, penniless, or when they're under attack, that there is no support. So that's very important.
Tur-Ha, Nicole, thank you so much. Anything to add?
Thank you for having us on.
Grateful for your work to transform an unjust economy into something that can work for all of us.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. Lift is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. To listen to all our past episodes or to share your thoughts about the show with us, visit www.lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also subscribe to this podcast through iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please take a moment to rate us on iTunes. It's really very helpful in allowing these ideas to reach a wider audience. Once again, thanks for listening.